Good morning. My name is Frank Gaffney. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger China, and I'm delighted once again to serve as the Master of Ceremonies for this threat briefing of the committee on a very important, indeed highly topical subject. That would be the occasion just yesterday of the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board declaring that it was determined and would continue to pursue an initiative it initially adopted in 2017 to put the retirement funds of federal employees, civilian and military, past and present, into, among others, Chinese companies, which, as we will discuss in the course of the program today, include some of the most problematic, not only in China, but in the world. This is the most recent of quite a number of these threat briefings that we have conducted both here in Washington, D.C., most recent one as today here in the beautiful Kirby Center of Hillsdale College. We are very appreciative to Matt Spalding and his team for enabling us to be here once again. And also in Chicago, New York, and Dallas to date, as part of the committee's mission to raise awareness about the threat posed to our country by Communist China and the Chinese Communist Party that runs it, and to provide, in response to identifiable problems, specific, constructive, and concrete solutions to those problems. This is a mission that we believe has been passed on to us from previous iterations of the Committee on the Present Danger. I'm very pleased to have the former executive director of one of those iterations, Chet Nagel, here with us today. And I think my colleague, our chairman, Brian Kennedy, might say a few more words about what the committee is up to. I just wanted to say a word of welcome on my own part, and also just ask if we could, that we begin this program with a moment of silence, in which I hope you might join me in silent prayer for the people of Hong Kong, and for that matter, the people of Taiwan and the people of China itself, who are all now either actively suffering at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party or seem likely to be in the not too distant future. Thank you. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome back to the committee's microphone its chairman, Brian Kennedy, former president of the Claremont Institute, and these days the driving force behind the American Strategies Group. Have I got that right? Please join me in welcoming Brian Kennedy.
Thank you, Frank. Good morning, everyone. Not far from here, the subject of impeachment is on everyone's mind, as if the threat to our republic comes from our dealing with Ukraine, such as the nonsense that dominates Washington. If there is a singular purpose of the committee, it is the intellectual reorientation of our national security and political elites to assess, evaluate, and understand the potential threat of the People's Republic of China. If there is good news, it is that this administration is characterized by the common sense and determination of President Donald Trump. The president's national security strategy treats China like a great power competitor, unlike previous administrations. The president dispenses with ideological rhetoric or characterizes China in such a way that in fact it's a sober realization that China will act in its own interest come what may. The common sense of all that points the president to the realization that tough trade deals and an end to the theft of America's intellectual property will need to be matched by a rebuilding of the American military, including the creation of the new Space Force. But there is a political class in Washington, call it the permanent bureaucracy, the deep state, the Washington establishment, the administrative state, some call it, that by and large believes something else. At one point in our diplomatic relations, it was taken as a given that so long as the United States engages with China, they will evolve someday into a free society that respects both the political and economic rights of its people and other nations. That economic freedom will lead inexorably to political freedom. This was held as an article of faith by economic and political conservatives, liberals, American businessmen, and elites on Wall Street who saw the enormous potential of open economic relations between the two most powerful economies in the world. This view, it would appear, has evolved. Now there appears to be little hope that China will become a free and open society. Indeed, now that this appears inevitable, the Washington establishment scorns such naivete and acts as if it never held its earlier opinion. Today, Americans are being asked to accept China's bad behavior as the cost of doing business, or the cost of being part of the global economy. That China will do nefarious things, and that we Americans will merely have to nod and accept these transgressions as the new rules of the road. For instance, during the meeting of this committee this morning, 14 people in America will die from an overdose of fentanyl. This fentanyl comes from the People's Republic of China as the authorities there abet a narcotics war against the United States. I'm not sure what else you could call it. If any other nation on earth engaged in such activities, we would likely have invaded, for the loss of life would simply have been too monstrous. In the case of China, we are merely to bemoan the fact that these things occur. We are asked as Americans today not to be surprised that China represses the citizens of Hong Kong and engages in the violent suppression of democratic protests. We are asked to look the other way as over 1 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang are imprisoned and put in re-education camps. We are asked to accept as inevitable their ongoing military buildup in the islands of the South China Sea, their building of an advanced nuclear arsenal that targets the United States, witness their recent display of the DF-17 missile, and their military alliances and material cooperation with Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Today, the work of this committee has been to illustrate that China is at war economically with the United States and building a military to supplant our global advantage. While the United States has fought wars in the Middle East to the tune of some $3 trillion, the People's Republic of China has been building a military with the capability of challenging and someday defeating the United States. They have built advanced aircraft, the largest army in the world, a navy that is larger than that of the United States, and an arsenal of advanced nuclear ballistic missiles that can destroy America's great cities. They may not be on the same qualitative level as the U.S., but what they lack in technical refinement, they make up for in quantity. The axiom that quantity has a quality all its own is given special meaning when it comes to China. But even here, that may be something of an overstatement. The Chinese fourth-generation fighter aircraft, for instance, demonstrate a quality and lethality that should have American policymakers deeply concerned. Now, let me be clear. President Trump has not characterized China as an enemy. In his mind, they are instead a great nation with enormous potential, both economic and military, especially when it comes to their ability to challenge the United States. Also, as a practical matter, as he engages in negotiations over trade, tariffs, and the theft of intellectual property, it would be impossible to have fruitful conversations after vilifying China as a quote-unquote enemy. But the president has systematically addressed what China has done and what it continues to do. I believe the president is focusing exactly on the right things when it comes to China. The job for his administration is to back him up on that. And we are still seeing that underway. We need to see the Defense Department and the State Department and the Treasury Department follow the president's very tough lead when it comes to all this. Our purpose here today and with the work of the committee is to provide to the media and the Washington policy community the best case for what must be done to address the threat from the PRC. We have assembled an important group of policy experts to help us with that this morning. With that, let me thank you again for coming. Let me thank Frank Gaffney for his vital leadership on this. Thank you.
Brian, thank you so much. We have a number of people who are going to be making presentations. Not all of them could be with us in person, so we are blessed to have them joining us either by video or by audio, as the case may be. I will introduce each of them in turn, and I just want to say thank you to all of you for being here. Those of you in the room have in front of you a set of papers that will be available to everyone on our website shortly at presentdangerchina.org. And just to give you a sense of what they are, there is a one-page point paper that talks specifically about today's topic, the key facts concerning Chinese penetration of the U.S. government's pension plan, the Thrift Savings Plan. A list of some of the most egregious Chinese companies that are currently listed on our stock markets, that are described as malevolent Chinese companies in the Morgan Stanley Capital International indices, specifically the All-Country World Index, which is the one to which the Thrift Savings Plan will be mirrored if the board that oversees that plan has its way. There's also on your table a petition, which we will be forwarding to the Congress and the President today, signed by some 1,700 people so far. We're hoping that others will lend their names to it as well. You can sign up at presentdangerchina.org. A petition simply saying, please don't do this with respect to the plan to allow Chinese penetration of the government's thrift savings plan. There's also a report here from Bloomberg News that was published just yesterday in the aftermath of the decision by the Thrift Savings Plan. We'll be hearing much more about that momentarily. And just two documents that are also important to understanding the back and forth here. A letter signed by 6 members of the United States Senate, a bipartisan group led by Senator Marco Rubio of Florida and Senator Jeanne Shaheen, Democrat of New Hampshire, that went to Michael Kennedy, the chairman of the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board, urging that the board reconsider and abandon this policy plan. And then finally, the letter that was issued yesterday in response to the senator's letter from Michael Kennedy, which essentially said, thank you for your interest in what we're doing, and we're not going to give you what you've asked for. We're going to persist in this plan. Before we get into some of the particulars of this with several of our distinguished presenters, I want to just invite a man who has served in a number of sensitive positions inside the United States government. He's an attorney by training, but has been a specialist in China, both with respect to the mainland, and he's now very active with several institutes involved with the defense of freedom in Taiwan, but particularly relevant to our topic today and important, I think, to giving us, in addition to what Brian has said, a broad perspective as to why what we're here to discuss today matters so much. is Joseph Bosco, a former country desk officer in the Secretary of Defense's office for China. Joe, it's great to have you with us. Welcome.
Thank you, Frank, and welcome to all. I think you'll find some resonance between my comments and those that Brian Kennedy has already made. Not surprisingly, we're pretty much on the same wavelength. For 4 decades since Richard Nixon's opening to China, both Republican and Democratic administrations have been asleep at the switch by ignoring the rising threat from Communist China. Nixon himself, looking back at his own role years later, said he feared we had created a Frankenstein's monster. When the Senate Foreign Relations Committee considered the potential impacts of China's entry into the World Trade Organization, I was called as a witness and testified in opposition. Senator Jesse Helms, the committee chair, asked me only one question: would accession to WTO succeed in changing China? I replied that I was more concerned with how it would change us. And since China entered the world system, Western governments, corporations, academics, think tanks, and Wall Street have all chosen to look the other way, as Beijing built its threat and demonstrated its hostility before our very eyes. The Trump administration is the first to recognize the multidimensional danger and to take meaningful steps to address it. The Department of Defense has issued 3 major policy documents describing the malign posture of China, while the West was focused on the threats from radical Islam. The National Security Policy, the National Defense Policy, and the Indo-Pacific Strategic Policy Report lay out the administration's vision of the challenge presented to the Western world by China's communist dictatorship. It also lays out an American strategy to confront it through an all-of-government approach and cooperation with America's allies and regional security partners, such as Taiwan. Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo delivered major speeches recently confirming the Trump administration's clear-eyed approach to the existential danger, and they included human rights as an essential factor in confronting it. The administration has backed its statements of assertive U.S.-China policy, both in its military budget and preparedness, and by its no-nonsense approach in freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea and its transits through the Taiwan Strait. The strategy is clearly one of peace through strength and strength of will, which helped win the Cold War against the Soviet Union. Being clearly prepared for military confrontation in that period obviated the need to resort to actual force. China is presenting a somewhat different challenge and may be willing to engage in at least the first stage of military conflict, in the expectation that the West will fold first and use a so-called off-ramp to prevent further escalation. But Roger Robinson offers a powerful non-kinetic tool to reduce China's threat by eliminating or drastically reducing its ability to finance its military buildup, its aggressive policies, and its political repression through invasion into the very financial heart of our capitalist system, the U.S. stock market. Who would have thought that our 401ks would be used to buy China's weapon systems and instruments of torture against Uyghurs, Tibetans, Christians, Falun Gong, and political dissidents? We ignore Mr. Robinson's warnings at our peril. At the time that Lenin was in power, that's the original Vladimir, he said that capitalists would gladly sell communists the rope by which to hang them. Through instruments like the Federal Retirement Investment Board, we are also providing the wealth for them to buy the rope. I apologize for that. One ray of light that I saw in the letter that was sent by the Thrift Investment Board was its reference to the Treasury Department's Office of Financial Assets, Foreign Asset Control. According to the letter, that office within the Treasury Department has the power to ban investment in entire countries and corporations which represent a security risk to the United States. I think that would be the next step, Frank and Brian, for us to explore with the administration as to what the Treasury Department has already the power to do. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Joe, and for your both past and continuing service to our country. Speaking of service to our country, I'm very pleased to be able to introduce, albeit via video, a man who has both succeeded quite significantly in the financial sector. Sandwiched between his service in uniform in the United States Navy and his service today as that service's secretary. His name is Richard Spencer, and we have a video from him filmed, I believe, in Norway, where he is at the moment on official business. And I'm very grateful to him for joining us this way, as well as for an extraordinarily powerful op-ed that he wrote in the Wall Street Journal about 2 weeks ago, decrying this idea of the thrift savings plan being used to arm our enemies. Let's go to the videotape.
Good morning. I wish I could be with you today to talk about a topic that means quite a bit to me, but I find myself in Norway, one of our strongest NATO allies. I want to thank everyone at the Committee on the Present Danger China, particularly Brian Kennedy, Roger Robinson, and Frank Gaffney. I have always said there is a place at the table for China if it respects the rules-based international order. Unfortunately, China continues to flout the rules that keep us all secure and enable commerce to flourish. Beijing has a clear public record of coercion, influence, operations, and military actions that threaten the sovereignty of other nations and regional stability. China has engaged in state-directed IP theft, human rights abuses, cybercrime against our military and our suppliers, large-scale surveillance and espionage. They also have violations of international law of the sea, coercion of developing nation to acquire ports, attempts to control the South China Sea, and the establishment of a polar silk route in the Arctic. Incredibly, the retirement funds of American service members may soon help fund these activities. As I wrote in the Wall Street Journal, the decision by the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board to invest in the All Countries World Index will support Chinese companies that the United States has labeled as sanction violators, fraudulent actors, IP thieves, and human right abusers. We must stand with our Indo-Pacific allies and partners against China's violations instead of underwriting its behavior. Even if I was to acquiesce to the argument of investors who believe national security and human rights should not be parameters for consideration in a true return model, I would still mandate that Chinese-listed enterprises file and report as required both by the SEC and PCAOB as all other listed companies do. The Memorandum of Understanding between the SEC and the CCP Finance Authority must be dissolved, and Chinese companies need to report like every other listed company, to include full audit reports with working papers, material risk to shareholder value, board composition to include party member affiliation. Thank you for letting me join you from afar, and thank you for your continued focus on this very important topic. It's a whole-of-government competition on both sides of the fence.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And you've now heard reference made several times to one of the men who has helped, I think, both identify the problem of China's penetration of and exploitation of our capital markets in general, and specifically has raised the warning about what is happening with respect imminently to this federal retirement system plan, is our next speaker. His name is Roger Robinson. He has been deeply involved in international economic affairs, both in the private sector as a vice president and assistant to the chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, chairman at the time being David Rockefeller. Subsequently, as the senior director for international economic affairs on the Reagan National Security Council, where he played a critically important role in helping that president deal with his time's existential threat to freedom, with the help, I want to say, of an earlier incarnation of this group, the Committee on the Present Danger. And thanks in part to Roger's important contributions to the strategy for actually rolling back and defeating the Soviet Union, creating conditions that have resulted in the freedom of hundreds of millions of people, both inside the old Soviet Union itself and the evil empire more generally. Roger has been working both in a private sector capacity in the interval with RWR Advisory Group and as the chairman of an institution he founded in the Czech Republic, under whose banner he is coming to us today, the Prague Security Studies Institute. And I'm very proud to have him here with us for a return appearance at the Committee on the Present Danger to help us update on what has happened since our last meeting here in September, notably what is going on Capitol Hill, but also what has been the response to the pressure from Capitol Hill by the Federal Thrift Investment Board. Roger Robinson, welcome.
Well, thank you, Frank. It's a pleasure to be back before the committee. I would say that before we get into the actions of the Thrift Savings Board or Plan Board yesterday, it might be useful to reprise briefly the stakes and where we really are on the issue of China's penetration of the U.S. capital markets. What kind of volume are we talking about? Well, one estimate that has come from folks at the Rhodium Group was that on the equity side of the equation, the stock side, China may have as much as $1.9 trillion that's been taken out of the U.S. equity markets. There could be as much as another trillion in dollar-denominated bonds. Now, these are very difficult figures to come by, I can tell you. And so we're still laboring to get a sense of the scale of this challenge to our national security and our fundamental values on the human rights side. But let's just say for the moment that we're dealing in trillions, not billions, not even hundreds of billions. And if that's the case, you can appreciate that we spend $700 billion, thank goodness, on defense a year, and the multiples that that represents of our defense spending. You might wonder why China seems to have a limitless checkbook, whether it's for trying to take control of countries in the region, what we call nation capture, or even region capture, the ability to acquire strategic assets, our most advanced technologies, the leaps and bounds they've made in the Made in China 2020 initiative and AI and quantum computing, of course 5G, others. It just seems as though we not only have a peer competitor, but someone who is investing considerably more than our good selves. Where does that money come from? You don't see them tapping into their $1.1 trillion in reserves in the U.S. Treasury bills, nor do you see them tapping into their $3 trillion in overall reserves. So it begs the question, where are these dollars coming from? Well, this is probably going to be a good hint as to where. And when we talk about our capital markets, remember, no screening mechanism's ever been up. No diligence ever performed. We have no idea who these Chinese companies are really, in terms of themselves and their subsidiaries. What kind of national security abuses have they engaged in the past? Are they sanctions violators, proliferators? Are they advanced weapons manufacturers? Are they PLA affiliated? Are they major human rights abusers with their surveillance cameras, facial recognition technology of the type that you see atop the walls of concentration camps in Xinjiang or at the train stations in Tibet? In other words, no one cared about the material risks to share value and corporate reputation to those companies and American investors who engage with them and invest in them. That hasn't happened. And it's a very troubling dearth of diligence. We have no oversight like CFIUS, our Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, much less the strengthening that FIRMA legislation represented. There, at least, we're trying to get a handle on the acquisition targets of China and the United States to ensure that they're not up to something that is going to be detrimental to our national security interests. But nothing like that with the money. So, for 20 plus years, this entire arena has been untreated. China felt it was sacrosanct. We were complacent. Wall Street certainly didn't mind or care. The SEC never regarded national security abuses and human rights abuses as material risk that needed to even be disclosed, much less think about restricting access to the U.S. markets. But disclosure itself is the SEC's principal mission. It's to ensure that American investors have the kind of information they need to make an informed decision. That's their mandate. So it is very troubling, the fact that we have unwitting American investors in these hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars of funds under management. It's not just the MSCI, All Country World, ex-US index that's the problem here. When you think about the MSCI Emerging Market Index, it makes the All Country World appear tame. There, they have 20% of those funds under management invested in China. They may go as high as 40% by some estimates. Now, there's $2 trillion signed up formally for the MSCI Emerging Market Index, roughly. But there's as much as 14 trillion that mimic or mirror it automatically and reflexively. So you can do the math. We're talking $16 trillion. What does it mean to have 20%? What does it mean to go up to 40%? So if we're wondering what's afoot here, think about the fact of who these folks are. They are the proliferators. They are the sanctions violators, and the list goes on. Now, it's not to say that all of them represent this kind of threat or menace. But do we really know? Are we differentiating at least? Are we disclosing? At the very least, do the American people have any sense of this at all? Now, that takes us to the Federal Thrift Savings Plan. $578 billion, 5.7 million federal employees. They are transitioning the I fund, the international fund of that index, all of it, from a fund that is dedicated entirely to developed countries only, no emerging markets, no China, no Russia, to the MSCI All Country World ex-US index that has many of these Chinese bad actors. It has 5 Russian companies that are under US sanctions presently. Not past violators of sanctions, current violators. We can't do business with them with a 10-foot pole by law, but it's okay to invest in them. It's okay to fund them. It's okay to give them all the prestige of being in the world's most voluminous and deepest capital markets, which you know they take to the bank and leverage every day. So where's the penalty there? Where's the consistency in US policy? These are the kinds of concerns we have. Where is the SEC on recognizing that we just had companies like Hikvision, SenseTime, Megvii, all sanctioned by the United States, put on the entity list of the Department of Commerce? That's a sanction of a kind, to be sure, and it damages share value and corporate reputation, and yet human rights abusers are not regarded as material risk. How does that work? And the list goes on. I mean, we have a circumstance like the Secretary of the Navy just mentioned. Where is the compliance with U.S. securities laws? Where's the PCAOB audits? Where's the compliance with Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank? Where are the disclosure of the financials? They're regarded as state secrets, a black box. You're not able to look at Chinese financials. Can you believe it? The preferential treatment being given over American corporate counterparts? Preferential treatment. Forget the perils. Look at that for just a moment. And then we have the concern about indexes. Well, these indexes are now the thing. Passive investing is now ruling the roost on Wall Street. The FTSE Russell Index went to the China A-shares market in June, which is Chinese companies on their mainland exchanges, and picked up 1,097 Chinese companies into their index. Do we really think that they perform diligence on those and their subsidiaries? Do we really think any of the considerations that are being talked about today were in the picture as active considerations and concerns? Think again. It's just not on. And again, Bloomberg Barclays, aggregate global index. I've heard it's as big as 54 trillion in funds under management. They announced proudly that they were going to purchase 362 Chinese companies, including many banks, for that index. And the list goes on. So this kind of reckless and perilous additions to indexes that are avoiding SEC regs are basically avoiding disclosure and diligence. They're moving into the portfolios instantaneously of scores of millions of Americans. How many Americans? Maybe 150 million are in our markets today. I don't know precisely, but I've heard estimates in that range. So let's talk about a lobby. You know, we talk about the China lobby. How's it going to work if 24, 36 months from now, there are another 2 to 3 trillion placed in our markets, both in equities and debt, read bonds. And Americans wake up one morning and they see that in their retirement accounts and their investment portfolios, 17, 22, 25% of their total investment portfolios are in Chinese securities. Well, what happens that day? You have a new China lobby that is cosmically larger than the current one of scores of millions of Americans, again, with a financial vested interest in making sure that there are no penalties, no sanctions imposed against China, independent of the seriousness of the offenses, for fear that it's going to damage the value of their retirement accounts and their investment portfolios. You know what they're going to do. That, ladies and gentlemen, is called checkmate. That is when we wake up too late. This is an urgent matter. The TSP board, which the long form is the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board, if I've got that, but I'll just call it the TSP board for efficiency, kicked the can down the road 3 or 4 times on making the decision as to whether or not they were going to stand by their November 2017 decision to move the I funds, as they're called, over to the MSCI All Country World ex-US Index. Well, after kicking it down the road, they finally decided yesterday that they're sticking with their guns. that they're going to make sure that they remain the darlings of Wall Street and don't rock the boat on this. And they went ahead and reaffirmed that this is what they're going to do. Part of their explanation was, and this is quoting from their letter to several senators, including Senator Rubio, who was the lead player on this. Quote, "The law requires the board to develop investment policies which provide for prudent investments suitable for accumulating funds for the payment of retirement income." That's an interesting word. Prudent. Prudent? Really? What we're talking about here is their definition of prudence. Then they went on to say that their investment advisor, Aon Hewitt, reviewed multiple indexes and benchmarks for each fund, and part of the criteria was the acceptance of the indexes by the investment community. Catch this, the appropriateness of the indexes for the TSP, and the estimated costs associated with making a change. Let me read that one back. Appropriateness of the indexes for the TSP. I guess we want Nancy Pelosi's personal dollars to be funding the roundup of Tibetans at train stations. I guess we want the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs underwriting the militarization of the illegal islands in the South China Sea. I guess we want the Secretary of State holding multiple U.S. sanctioned companies in his portfolio. Not to mention our uniformed military, who are funding the advanced weapon systems that are targeting them. That's what, quote, appropriateness, unquote, looks like to that board. They actually had the nerve to call it lower risk. Well, risk can be pretty low if you're deleting national security and human rights material risk. I mean, if you're deleting whole categories of risk, I suppose it looks better, huh? And so this story goes on. And they defended the decision by showing us just how many other folks in America are holding the MSCI All-Country World Index and its companion index providers from Vanguard, BlackRock in particular. They showed that the top 10 of the largest publicly traded companies in the United States are holding these indexes. They found that the majority of the top 20 state public pension systems are holding these indexes. They found that the top 10 of the defense contractors of the United States are holding these indexes, and that makes it okay. Oh, no, no, no. These are symptoms of the disease. All they've done in their research is illuminated further for us the scale of this massive security challenge to the United States and its fundamental values. So I'll just close up by saying, time is tight. This decision goes into force by their own statement in February of 2020. They've made their decisions. Luckily, Marco Rubio, Democrat Jeanne Shaheen have made theirs. Senator Rubio called the decision unconscionable. He vowed legislative action on the issue and said, quote, refusal to act in the best interest of the United States will not go without consequence. Senator Shaheen said, there is no excuse for this decision. Quote, this should have been an easy call to reverse course, yet the board decided to double down on this dangerous proposal. That's bipartisanship, ladies and gentlemen. That's what it's going to take. Maybe even veto-proof legislation. I'd like to think that the White House and the administration is going to come up on the net on this and take some executive action of their own. So these are the kinds of challenges we face, and all I can urge you to do is to say, as I've said before, not on our watch. This is our money. This is personal.
Roger, thank you very much. Among those who could not be with us today, but who is making a singularly important contribution to public education about the problem we face broadly of economic warfare against our country, both that practiced by the Communist Chinese and others, is Kevin Freeman. Kevin is a senior fellow of the Center for Security Policy. He is a published author of best-selling books like Secret Weapon and Game Plan. He is also the star, if you will, the host of a terrific program that I commend to all of you called Economic War Room with Kevin Freeman, which appears at Blaze TV. Kevin has made a special effort, given the gravity of this particular issue, to focus on it in a format that I believe will air shortly as one of the Economic War Room programs, but also, I'm hopeful, as an infomercial that will enable large numbers of people who don't subscribe to Blaze TV to see it and to learn from it and to become engaged in what Roger has properly said is a personal matter for an awful lot of us. We have, as a result of Kevin's great efforts, several clips that he has been kind enough to share in a sort of sneak preview, if you will, with us. One that sort of introduces two others by Kevin. I'll say a word about the subsequent two, but let's roll Kevin's introductory one.
This is Kevin Freeman from the Economic War Room. We've been looking into this issue of China infiltrating our markets and really the danger of having our thrift savings plan invested into Chinese stocks. Now, in the War Room, we did a special episode which will be airing, and it will include Roger Robinson and Kyle Bass and Lieutenant Colonel Alan West. But beyond that, we brought in some actual veterans, people who laid their lives on the line for this nation, and asked them how they felt about their money being invested in companies that might be a threat to our nation. One of those individuals was Alan Clark. Here's a man who left 2 legs in Vietnam. He was a wounded warrior. He served in the Veterans Administration. He served in the state of Texas, a wonderful gentleman. And he was shocked to find out that he couldn't invest in international securities unless he invested into China if they make this decision. The thrift savings plan represents the money of patriotic men and women in the armed services, or veterans, or retirees from government, or actual government employees. And the idea that they could be forced with their international funds to invest in our adversary, that's shocking. And when you learn from Roger Robinson what some of these companies that will be receiving American money do, it's frightening. So I stand with the Committee on the Present Danger as a proud member to say we must stop this decision of the thrift savings plan. This board must recognize that it is not an issue of, well, it might make economic sense. It makes no economic sense, and it certainly doesn't make national security sense. This is Kevin Freeman from the Economic War Room.
Thank you. As Kevin mentioned, we have a distinguished veteran, thanks to Kevin's interview, who happens also to have been a member of Congress in the House of Representatives, Lieutenant Colonel Alan West, United States Army, retired. Alan has many accomplishments to his credit, but I think most especially he has earned a well-deserved reputation for clarity of thought and integrity and courage, something that he demonstrated under fire in the uniform of the United States Army in combat and also in the United States Congress. Let's bring up Alan West, if we can, as our next
Right
contributor.
now, in the thrift savings plan, as you know, it's invested in the United States, and you can invest in foreign countries also through the MSCI EFA index. That's Morgan Stanley Capital International. And the EFA is Europe, Australia, Far East. It basically is the developed markets of the world.
Sure.
But there's a new push. We need to move it to the MSCI All Country World Index. Now, do you know all the ins and outs?
Well, the thing is that when you start talking about all country index, when you start talking about this globalism, the thing that I think that we have failed to understand is that China learned a lesson from the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union did not collapse militarily. The Soviet Union collapsed economically.
That's right.
And what the Chinese understood is that, you know, somehow we've got to maintain our philosophy of governance, being the socialist communist model. But yet, how can we inject ourselves into this globalist market? How can we use capitalism to bolster us and keep us in the position that we're in and become like a tick to all of these Western economic nations and make it so hard for them to be removed, because all of a sudden, next thing you know, you can get Lyme disease.
So how they do that is they suck out intellectual property.
Yes.
They've hacked the American system. They demand that corporations
Technology
entering,
transfers.
You've got to give us your technology if you want to enter our markets. But now there's a whole new and more insidious thing, is they're actually seeking to get American capital. They've gotten stocks on our stock exchange.
Sure.
And they've asked for a lot of investments in things that we don't really know what they're doing.
It's about expanding their, not regional, but global hegemonic dominance. And the fact that we are looking at extending investments to help China to grow and build their military and their totalitarian regime is unconscionable that we would be doing that. I mean, you know, I might as well give you my concealed carry weapon and make sure you have plenty of bullets and say, shoot me in the head.
Well, that's a sober thought on which to conclude that interview, but great to have Alan West, even though he could not be with us in person. Finally, from the Economic War Room, we have a founding member of the Committee on the Present Danger, a significant player in the financial sector with deep knowledge of China and Hong Kong and their financial situation, as well as the implications of these sorts of initiatives for our financial as well as economic and national security well-being. His name is Kyle Bass. He is the Chief Investment Officer of Heyman Investments in Dallas, Texas.
For me, it's important to say we're not just going to stop the Thrift Savings Plan from investing in the MSCI All World because of China. What we should be saying is, now China's the worst offender. However, we should be saying that we should not commit the Thrift Savings Plan or that money of any retiree in the U.S. into a company that doesn't submit itself to audits, that isn't Dodd-Frank compliant, that doesn't adhere to the same standards as U.S. securities do, U.S. companies do to raise money here.
So this is almost an Enron question as much as anything else.
Big, yeah, it's as big because, right, if you've got companies that are in China or Russia, which, as you know, are adversaries of ours, or pick another country, pick Brazil or pick Argentina, that might have a company that wants to raise money in the U.S. that doesn't submit itself to an audit or isn't Dodd-Frank compliant, why should we allow them to raise money?
Explain that. The company doesn't submit itself to an audit. What does that mean? When we're investing in Chinese companies, they're not the same as investing in U.S.?
That's correct. So Chinese companies, the Chinese government has basically stipulated that audits of their companies are national security concerns, and therefore they should be exempt. And so when you look at all of the companies, the 160 plus companies listed here that are particularly Chinese ADRs, none of those companies submit themselves to a true covered audit as deemed to be an audit by the Public Accounting Oversight Board in the U.S., the PCAOB.
So we don't know when they report earnings that those are actually what they're reporting. They're certainly not on our standards, and they're certainly not measured in the same way that we measure our companies.
Our auditors have never been let in, meaning the big four, the auditors that we know and trust in the US. But when you bring up Enron, you think about Enron, WorldCom, you think about some of the biggest frauds in the US, and they actually submitted themselves to US audit standards. Imagine how bad the numbers really are of companies that refuse to submit themselves to audits. And that's where all of that money's going. And again, China's the worst offender, but there are many other offenders on that list. It's just less market cap, less focus. But I'm of the opinion that we shouldn't allow any foreign companies raise money in the United States that don't adhere to US law. I know that sounds like a crazy idea, but as we sit today, that is exactly how they're raising money.
So, ladies and gentlemen, just to review the bidding here, you've been told about the national security implications of this. You've been told about the fact that from an economic point of view, it doesn't make sense. You've been told that there is, in addition to everything else, this unbelievable suspension of the rules of our markets in order to enable transactions like these that don't actually conduce to our national security or economic interests. There's so much wrong with this picture. It is almost unimaginable that it is advanced to this point, let alone that all other things being equal, it's going to happen. And let me just mention, Roger touched on this, but just to give you some specific examples of the companies we're talking about benefiting from the investments of military personnel, past and present, as well as other government employees. A company called Avi China Industry and Technology, better known as AVIC. It and its subsidiaries develop and produce a range of aircraft, unmanned aircraft systems, and airborne weapons for the People's Liberation Army. Its subsidiaries have been sanctioned by the United States government for proliferation activities that played a key role in enabling Iran to develop its missile capabilities. This is a company, in other words, whose business is killing Americans. It is unimaginable to me that anyone with any sense of patriotism or self-preservation would contemplate the idea of having our own military personnel underwriting such a company. And by the way, it's not just those men and women in uniform who are being targeted by these sorts of products. It's the rest of us as well. How about Hikvision Digital Technology? Hikvision is a company that manufactures for the Chinese Communist Party security and video surveillance products that have been instrumental in the Chinese government's efforts to put into place a surveillance state apparatus, notably, but not exclusively, in Xinjiang, where it is being employed literally in the concentration camps in which those millions now of Uyghurs, Muslims mostly, and others, Tibetans perhaps, and who knows who else in the future. Perhaps people from Hong Kong or people from Taiwan. In what are estimated by some accounts to be 1,000 concentration camps in that sector of China alone. And then, of course, there's the so-called social credit score system that China is now operating against all of its people, not just Christians and Falun Gong and other minorities, but all of the Chinese, manipulating and controlling them in a totalitarian fashion that on his most imaginative day, I believe George Orwell could not have contemplated. Then there's Zhongzheng Telecommunications Equipment Corporation, better known as ZTE. It's been subjected to U.S. sanctions for its economic and trade activities that, among other things, have breached our sanctions on Iran by providing Iranian telecommunications companies with ZTE products, enabling, of course, not just Iran's society to have better telecommunications, but the Iranian military, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. In other words, the very entities that are most threatening to our interests, our friends and allies in the region, and of course, ultimately to us. How about the Chinese company known as China Communications Construction? It has over a half of China's dredging industry capacity. What, one might ask, has that been put to use doing? Well, among other things, it has been observed conducting dredging and other activity in support of Beijing's illegal island building in the South China Sea, and supporting the fortification of those islands, which is, of course, turning them into bastions from which the Chinese will try to control those vital waters through which I think something like $1 trillion worth of trade transits every year. And it's not just, of course, the waters of the South China Sea, it's the airspace above it as well that is now at risk. China Unicom is another telecommunications company. It has been involved in these South China Sea fortified bastions. China Mobile, another telecommunications operation. It has been providing telecommunications capability and support for those islands as well. And China Telecom has been intimately involved in that security state apparatus that I mentioned a moment ago. These are companies that we are being told we must invest in. If those of us who are in the thrift savings plan want to have a diversified portfolio by having international companies in the mix, you are going to have to invest in these companies and others like them. How can that be? The question was actually literally posed in a previous meeting here, and I just will paraphrase what Roger Robbins had said, which I thought captured it perfectly. He said, it's not really hard to understand. He said, the people in the finance sector don't care about national security. They're interested in making money. And the people in the national security sector, by and large, with exceptions obviously, but mostly, don't know anything about finance. So you have a Venn diagram with no overlap, through which communist China is driving, I would say Mack trucks, but I'm sure that's not the brand they would use, full of bullion, our bullion, to our great detriment. A man who understands this very well, but who could not be with us today, but was with us at our last meeting. And I just learned last night that he couldn't come. So I've taken the liberty of asking our team to show you the short presentation that Chris Iacovella, who is the president and CEO of an important financial sector organization known as the American Securities Association. It represents basically the financial sector outside of Wall Street. I think of it as America. And we'll hear from Chris Iacovella some of his comments made before he knew about this particular development. He was sharing with me last night that he is deeply troubled by what the board has done, and you'll hear why right now.
I'd like to thank you, Frank, Brian, and the committee for inviting me here today to speak about such an important issue. The mission of the American Securities Association rests on two pillars: to promote the trust and confidence of American investors and to help small businesses across this country access the capital they need to create jobs and grow the American economy. Allowing any American investor to put their hard-earned money into passive indexes that include Chinese companies who routinely avoid financial audits satisfies neither pillar of this mission, and it threatens America's economic and national security. As a result of the TSP decision, one group of Americans, U.S. government employees saving for retirement, will now be compelled to invest in unaudited Chinese companies instead of transparently audited small businesses right here in the United States. The TSP decision borders on fiduciary malfeasance because it ignores a fundamental tenet of our securities laws, and that's investor protection. In the wake of the Enron and WorldCom scandals, it's difficult for me to understand how we can allow American investors to be exposed to companies who are not audited and who continually avoid these financial audits, simply because the Chinese government claims that the information contained in them is a quote-unquote state secret. This claim is outrageous. At a minimum, U.S. investors, savers, and retirees will be the ones who suffer if these companies turn out to be frauds. And at worst, U.S. investor dollars are being used to fund the Chinese military and a cyber army that relentlessly attacks this country on a daily basis. And no matter how you slice it, this money would be much better spent funding America's small businesses and growing this economy. The index providers who include China A-share companies in their indexes have no idea whether these companies are frauds, arms of the Chinese military, or supporting human rights abuses. Their diligence process rests on Wall Street pressuring them to include more Chinese companies in the indexes, because Wall Street knows this is a backdoor way around the SEC's company-specific disclosure and audit regime. And another question we should be asking is who exactly is pushing this agenda? And how much do they profit at the expense of American investors and small businesses? Is this the same group of mega Wall Street asset managers and index providers who push their social views of the world onto investors? And why are they suddenly so silent when it comes to American investor dollars flowing into opaque Chinese companies? I guess it turns out their profits and the need to pander to an adversarial nation are more important than the interests of American investors. Don't let the recent virtue signaling we've seen from their CEOs fool you. Taking the moral high ground on social issues stops at America's borders. I will leave you with this. Could you ever imagine a U.S. company pushing American investors into funds that included Russian companies during the Cold War? Absolutely not, because it's flat out wrong. America's Main Street investors and government employees should be investing in highly regulated, transparent businesses in the United States of America, not coerced by Wall Street to invest in unregulated companies in China. We call on the TSP board to immediately reverse its decision to force U.S. government employees to invest in any index that includes Chinese companies, because America's investors must not be a source of wealth that funds China's rise. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Chris Iacovella, and I'm sorry again that we didn't have him here, but we were glad we had him virtually. I think what we will do, we have one more speaker who is going to join us by phone shortly, but in the interest of further fleshing this out, I'd like to call the several speakers who are with us back up to do a brief Q&A. If you have questions, we would welcome them. They may have some further amplifying comments of their own, and I would ask Roger and Joseph and Brian Kennedy to join me right here at the podium, if you would, please. Joe? Any questions? Mr. Nagel, welcome.
My question is to fellow Reaganite Roger. While Roger was working in Washington doing important things, I was opposing Soviet submarines and ultimately the Cuban Missile Crisis, and later worked in the Middle East. I'm wondering if Soviet investment. Soviets hitting us to sell them the rope to hang us. We got the Chinese.
Well, thank you, Chet. I think that, yes, the parallels between the Soviet version of economic and financial warfare against the U.S., which we actively countered and ultimately led to its demise, and that of China, which is a much larger juggernaut, to be sure, much more diversified, much more capable economically and financially. You can't really compare the two. But there are certain similarities, and I think that's what Chet was looking to draw out. The similarities are that we were reacting to an effort by the Soviets at the time to use basically natural gas sales to Western Europe as a weapon of coercion, ultimately, that would be used at the appropriate level of dependency of Western Europe on Soviet natural gas supplies. So the Siberian gas pipeline was the project at the time that was underway at the very moment that the Soviets were massing troops on the Polish border to invade, in the event that Solidarity wasn't crushed and Pope John Paul silenced. President Reagan took a strong position on this and said that's not happening on his watch. But here's the kicker on the financial and economic side. The Siberian gas pipeline would have taken Western Europe's dependency on Soviet gas to well over 70%, maybe 80%. Now, you know, President Trump has been very concerned and actually called Germany a kind of wholly owned subsidiary of Russia today at 35%. Just imagine how he'd feel had there been no Reagan at, say, 75 or 80%. But we were also, we the West, in the form of Western governments and banks, financing the totality of the hard currency costs of the Soviet Empire worldwide, which are about $16 billion at the time. The Soviets only had total hard currency income of, say, $32 billion in 1981-82, 1/3 of the revenues of a General Motors or an Exxon at the time. And so we found ourselves, in a sense, picking up the tab for the better part of the Soviet Empire, and in effect, treating these gas sales as commercial, when indeed they were strategic. So we obviously wanted to cap Soviet gas deliveries to Western Europe to 30%, which we did. We eliminated the subsidized taxpayer underwritten interest rates on government credits. We dried up the private credit markets. We told the Saudis to pump 2 million barrels more a day. We decontrolled prices at the wellhead, lowering oil prices to $10 a barrel, knowing that the Soviets were 66% of their earning structure was dependent on oil and gas sales. So it's a petro nation then and now. And obviously, for every dollar drop in the price of a barrel of oil, they lost $500 to $1 billion in net income. Basically, we broke them into matchsticks over time. They weren't going to recover from that. Now, China, again, is different, but instead of, if you think about the subterranean nature, literally in some cases, of natural gas flows into Western Europe, today, China has selected our capital markets. You know, nobody ever regarded natural gas as being weaponized. There was no such thing as pipeline politics. They had never pulled the trigger on extorting NATO the way they surely would have had they ever had dependencies like the ones they were seeking. They would have. Reagan knew they would. We knew they would. It was a small cadre up against the rest of conventional wisdom, which was that this is a permanent fixture on the landscape of the globe, and the Soviet Union is going to be there for our children's children's children, and we better live with it. Today, we're told the same thing about China. So what you're not ever hearing about, interestingly, is the money. And that is the parallel that I would draw. I mean, the Thrift Savings Plan Board, as I said, announced all the top American companies, all the top American pension systems, public state pension systems, all of the defense contractors, they're all in the game, therefore it's okay. Well, there was just a few of us, as Chet remembers in the old days, that went against that conventional wisdom and said, no, 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 not on my watch. And there is no Soviet Union today. Now, that's where we are, in a sense. We're at that crossroads. And this is moving at a very fast clip. So we have to get religion on this pretty darn fast if we're going to get keep that lobby, if you will, that we talked about earlier, that lobby of scores of millions of Americans who are going to have that vested financial interest for a hands-off China policy. Well, if it's a hands-off China policy, I can tell you, we're done.
Yeah, one might say the hands will be around our throats. Dr. Pry?
Boy, does that make the scales fall off your eyes. That is so illuminating. You know, that ought to be reported and given to every member of Congress who's on a financial committee of any kind. That's my comment. I just thought that was brilliant. I mean, you really, really laid it out in a way, and, you know, you're right, Frank. They can drive a truck right through that. You're completely blind to it. My question is a naive question, because again, I don't know anything about this, but does this, these financial relationships that exist, that the Chinese can exploit with advantage, is there any kind of a synergism here that enables them to penetrate also our corporations, steal our technology in that dimension of the economic warfare too? Does it give them intelligence that might make it easier for them to conduct these other things that people like me have understood, you know, where they're stealing missile technology and stealth technology and all the rest?
I would say that money is a gateway. I mean, when you're in the financial industry to this regard, to this extent, not only do you have the funds to buy those strategic assets and get into those key startups that we're relying on for our innovation future, which they're single-mindedly focused on doing. There is an interconnection there that just doesn't quit. And we've looked at the technology piece, which is key, and we've gone after ZTE and Huawei and a number of other of the companies, thank goodness. And we've certainly gone after the trade imbalances on the tariff side and the like. But again, where's the key pillar, pillar 3? What about the money? Because unfortunately, it's the money that lubricates China's technology theft. It's the money that gives them the SWAT to intimidate regional neighbors. Not to mention Wall Street, who's being told that if they don't behave like good boys and girls, they're going to be out of this fantastic Elysian Field marketplace that they've been advertising since near the beginning of time, it feels like. So this is a blind spot that doesn't quit. And I can tell you that if we address the money, you're going to find, big surprise, that the rest of our national security challenges become vastly more manageable.
That's a great point, Peter. Part of this is an intellectual problem, isn't it?
We just don't get it. It'd be one thing if China were on the path toward becoming more free and open and democratic. But all that Roger's been describing is taking place as China is becoming more repressive and less they were never democratic per se, but that idea that economic freedom would lead to political freedom, that didn't happen, not going to happen. What really should bother us is that it's almost as if the cancer has spread so far among the American political and economic elites that the body politic is going to die. That once it spreads this far, China is making the bet that we're in too deep. We've got them. They're not going to back out now. We have them right where they want them. Right. We have them right where they want them. And it is partly a contest between globalism and economic nationalism. Trump represents America first and economic nationalism. This is an assault on that. Wall Street's betting that globalism is going to win. And it's almost like a religion. Not sure they're making money on it, but their entire goal is to intertwine our economy with theirs in such a way that there's no way to back out of it. What Roger's saying is we need to focus on that right now. We need to find a strategy for getting out of this mess, because at a certain point here, there is no backing out, and we're doomed. But, of course, we believe we can fix all that.
Joe Bosco?
I have two comments, but why don't we have that gentleman ask his question?
Well, we'll get to him.
Okay. Brian just mentioned something he said in his speech, that there's been a prevailing conventional wisdom that China, if China and the Soviet Union earlier, if they were integrated into the international system, they would moderate their policies and become more liberal and democratic. I think that's a very generous assessment, frankly. There are people, important decision makers, who've never cared whether China became democratic. They simply accepted it as a dictatorship that exists in the world, and we can do business with them. And that's what we've done. And Henry Kissinger is probably the leading exponent of that view. Read his books and see how much discussion you find of human rights and whether there is an expectation that China will ever become an integrated member of the international community. The other point is that I was struck by what Kyle Bass said in that video. The reason China is not willing to disclose the transparency that we expect of other companies was the term, it's not in China's national security interest. This is worse than Orwell. This is Alice in Wonderland. We're willing to jeopardize our national security because China says for them to play the game like everyone else jeopardizes their national security. So we've said, okay, yours trumps ours. This is incredible, the situation.
Well, it's not just incredible, I think it's obscene, personally. Let me just add a quick point, and then we'll come to several others of you who want to pose questions. On Peter's question, and there was a very nice compliment to Roger Robinson. I don't know if the mics picked it up, but as to your suggestion about making his presentation available, not just to members of Congress, but to the world, that's part of what we're doing here with the Committee on the Present Danger of China. And I just want to emphasize again, I'm extremely proud and want to thank Brian and our team that has been backstopping it. The presentdangerchina.org site is really one-stop shopping on all of these issues and many others, because what we're trying to do is really raise awareness about the broad thrust of what the Chinese have called unrestricted warfare that they've been waging against us. And the fact that they have been waging it against us, and the fact that we've known about it since a book was published by two People's Liberation Army senior colonels back in 1999, makes what we've just heard even more obscene. We've been on notice that, among other techniques, economic warfare is one of the vectors that they are using to take us down, to accomplish what Joe was just talking about. The other thing I just wanted to mention, which is in the nature of good news, I think, I have not met her yet. I hope we might have an opportunity for her to participate in one of these programs at some point. But Undersecretary of Defense Ellen Lord has unveiled an initiative to encourage patriotic investment. I think she has understood the problem that we're talking about here. We've heard from the Secretary of the Navy. He certainly understands it. But the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Ellen Lord, has been initiating, as I understand it, an effort to encourage people to make investments in America, patriotic investments in our security with our companies to enhance our competitiveness, both for commercial purposes, presumably, but also obviously for national security. And I just had a conversation earlier this week with an individual who I've known for a long time, been in the national security space on the chip and internet sort of side of our incredible national capabilities. And he said, for the first time in 40 years working in that space, 3 weeks ago, somebody, I don't know whether it was Ellen Lord, but I suspect it was, but somebody met with him and other senior people in Silicon Valley, both on the technology side and on the venture capital side. And they heard for the first time a very clear warning about what they were doing with their technology, what they were doing in selling their technology or their companies, what they were doing by partnering in venture capital initiatives with Chinese entities, that is detrimental to the security of the United States. So whoever did that, I hope it was Lord, but whoever did it, thank you for that. And it's a starting point, I think, for the kind of things that we've been talking about here need to be done, and we look forward to working with them in accomplishing it. Preston?
Thank you, Frank. This unconscionable investment that militarily enables China to our detriment is simply breathtaking. And so I'd like to ask you something I think is probably really difficult, but I'll ask it anyway. If you could please craft for me, for my benefit and others' benefits, a 30 to 45-second soundbite / elevator speech that I can use with people to alert them to this.
Always the easy questions. China has come to our markets with stock and bond offerings and extracted arguably trillions of dollars from our economy and into their own. It's been happening without any screening, with no disclosure, in contravention of U.S. securities laws. It has been calloused and insensitive to human rights, that it's never seen the light of day in U.S. government deliberations or those of the media or even in cocktail conversations of the American people. It has heretofore been unknown, a secret, in effect, strategy with the complicity of those who have something to gain. It's insidious, and it needs to be stopped now and disciplined and made compliant, or the consequences will be ruinous for the United States.
I would add to that, when you're buying a Chinese stock, you're betting on its success. These are state-owned enterprises. When you have trillions of dollars coming into the U.S. capital, being taken out of the U.S. capital markets, we are saying we are betting on the success of communist China and their communist state-owned enterprises. That seems to me, for most Americans, a threshold question that most people would say, well, no. And also, this is something I've always wanted to get from Roger. There's a trade deficit, and the president makes a big deal about the trade deficit. What about the finance deficit? Because your main point here, isn't it, that the finance matters more than the trade? It is. And so, this may be a rhetorical question, but the trade deficit is one thing, and it's important. The finance deficit is what's really critical. Yes, John.
Thank you, Brian. I want to compliment, actually, you, Frank, Roger, Joe, the whole committee. In many ways, this has been an education process over the last year or so.
Right.
This is a complex topic, but it's an education process. I'm definitely beginning to see signs of success here. There's always a lag time, but I'm beginning to see indicators of success in educating on this topic here. And this specifically is really the center of gravity of the whole situation. As the lights come on this topic, I'm beginning to detect skirting. So the lights have come on this topic. Still some lag time and key audiences understanding what's going on here. As the lights have come on, I'm beginning to detect skirting from the PRC. So they're beginning to understand that we understand the situation. So I have some posits on this, but what do you think, and this for all of you, and Roger may have some thoughts here, is the next counterpunch? The Soviets were too ignorant to understand some of our moves. The PRC is definitely beginning to understand that we're beginning to understand the situation. What's their counterpunch?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, which is, this is an educational process. People are just learning about this. The Chinese seem to be noticing that we're catching up with them, that we have figured out what Roger has known for all these years and been describing all these years. What is China going to do to punch back, as it were? I would start by saying, and then I'd love to hear what Roger and Joe think. I think the Chinese figure this nationalism, this is all Donald Trump. Let's wait him out. Let's see what happens next year. Is he going to survive politically? Let's do everything in our power to make sure he doesn't survive. Let's make life difficult for him. And if we don't make a trade deal, we don't make a trade deal. Guys like Trump are pretty rare, guys who really stand up for American interests. Most of these Republicans and Democrats in the future, they'll go back to the globalist mindset. Let's just wait them out. And so it seems to me their strategy is make life difficult for Donald Trump in his reelection. If they can get through that, they're almost home free. If not, they can adapt. They're playing a long game, and they know that American political and financial elites are corrupt. They know that already, and they're really the only thing that can stop that is if Donald Trump wakens the economic nationalism of the American people, which I believe he's doing and which you're suggesting.
Joe, Roger?
Well, I think that basically on the punchback, we're seeing it beginning now. The TSP board, the Thrift Savings Plan board, has hunkered down and made a decision after kicking the can down the road 3 or 4 times. That decision was to reaffirm that they're going with the MSCI All Country World Index ex-US. Now, that is going to be symptomatic of how they play this out. Think of the letters NBA, and you've got a good guidepost. They're going to intimidate Wall Street players like something you've never seen. After all, they strong-armed, according to the Wall Street Journal, MSCI to buy the A shares, unregulated, out of the Chinese mainland exchanges to begin with. That's a matter of record. And what are they going to do if MSCI All Country World, or its emerging market index, which is filling up with Chinese companies at an alarming pace, what happens if they decided to shed Hikvision because the heat got too intense on those natty concentration camps and Tibetan suppression? They probably might even be tempted. But the scathing attack that would come from, and the consequences that would come from Beijing will stay their hand. It's almost amazing. Hikvision is on the entity list. Their parent company has been on the entity list for a year for national security abuses. They're the poster child of human rights abuses. Isn't it a no-brainer to simply divest that one company? And yet no one has. Not the FTSE Russell, not the S&P Dow Jones, not the Bloomberg Barclays, if they even have them. I can't speak to that one, but certainly MSCI. Isn't it fascinating? Not one company of the types that Frank regaled us with have been divested. Now, that is Chinese intimidation. And that is greed on the part of Wall Street. They're more worried about offending China than they are standing up for our values, our security interests, and even federal securities laws, and are willing to ignore material risk to share value and corporate reputation that's putting American investors in harm's way. So that's the counterpunch of Beijing, and it is underway. Now, whether it's via Wall Street or directly in the case of the NBA itself, it doesn't really matter. We're going to be looking for effects, and we have to look no further than today's discussion, and that's just the beginning. If you think they're going to go quiet, they don't talk about this, you notice, because they still are praying that this will go into deep freeze for another 20 years and not be in one conversation in one part of America for another 20, beyond that. But, so they don't want to raise attention to it, but behind the scenes, you can hear the arms being twisted.
Let me just emphasize one point. It's illegal to do business with some of the companies we are investing in. How can that be? Where is the SEC? Where are the oversight committees in the Congress? What Roger's suggesting, implicitly at least, is there is a level of corruption at work here. Maybe it's threats, maybe it's just the opportunity to garner still more money. But the practical effect of what is happening here is that our statutes, our laws are being violated to the benefit of enemies of this country who are beavering away at trying to make us more vulnerable, not just to their pressure, but to their domination. I think we have another question here. Yes, ma'am. Would you identify yourself? I've forgotten to ask that of others, but if you would, please. You'll need to speak up, please.
It's hard to quantify, but it's in the billions of dollars, would be my answer to your first question. As far as the consequences of investing in companies on the entity list, you want to talk about loopholes. No penalties in the United States. You can hold OFAC-sanctioned companies outright. No consequence, no problem. It's as though they're lily-white American counterparts. It's just remarkable. So we have statutes that need to be written here. We have executive orders that need to be proclaimed here. We have possibly the use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of the President that's being screamed for at some level, if all else fails. Do we have the authorities? Oh, yes. But the fact that, again, you can have these glaring inconsistencies is a shocker. And then to see the TSP board use terms like we're being prudent and we're being appropriate for TSP members. You know, there's almost a cognitive dissonance at work here. There's if you believe it enough, it becomes true. I mean, the wagons are circled and hermetically sealed like something you'll rarely witness in our lifetime. We're finally, from a national security point of view, in the promised land. We're finally in the zone. The money.
Go ahead. Yes. I believe, as I said at one of our previous meetings, if the president himself understood all of these details, he would do exactly what Roger has described. I think the administration right now is looking very hard at all the trade matters. That's being negotiated heavily. I believe all the whole question of the theft of intellectual property is being discussed at very high levels, and I think those are the two main priority interests when it comes to China, just on the money side. I do think this is of great concern to the administration, given the fact that the president has stated publicly that he is deeply concerned about what China is doing when it comes to human rights abuses and their military buildup. And because there is still parts of the government that are looking at things like the entity list, that do follow these things, I do believe the administration is concerned about this. But it's one of those things that, given all the things that they have to deal with, to the extent that public opinion can be shaped by this group in these meetings, and that more and more Americans can understand this problem, the better off we will be, and the greater I think the administration will have an opportunity to focus on this. Let me say as an aside, Roger gave a talk at Hillsdale College. We're here at the Kirby Center here in Washington. This month, they did their imprimis featuring Roger's speech, and it goes to like 5 million Americans. I was told by one of its vice presidents that it was one of the most popular issues that they've ever had, that the response was overwhelming, that Americans are concerned about this, and it was something they hadn't heard about before. And so that's encouraging to me, and if we can take that enthusiasm and transfer it to the administration, I think the better off we'll be.
you want to say something further? Quickly.
Yeah. Like most administrations, and I've served in one, they sometimes are, how do I frame this? A house divided is too strong. Different views is a more diplomatic way of putting it. Depends what your mandate is, what your perspective is on this matter, but it doesn't have a unified view, the administration, best I know, which is quite natural because there are lots of folks that are trying to protect the momentum of the U.S.-China relationship. They see this as a potential irritant, to say the least. So we'll have to overcome some of that reflexive instincts on the part of some to try to keep it kind of off the front page, if you will, from their perspective. However, I think progress is being made, and I think the sensitivities and the good people are there to recognize this and act on it. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll see, with the groundswell of the type that Brian's referring to, of the 6 pieces of legislation, 4 in the Senate and 2 in the House. In other words, this genie is not going back in the bottle. This bell is not going to be unrung. So it's time to step up. And I think the administration will do so, but again, it takes some acclimating.
I want to thank our speakers. I'm sorry we're out of time at the moment because we have one final presentation in an audio form. We have been blessed in the past and had expected to have some members of Congress with us today. We have heard, as Roger mentioned, from Marco Rubio and Jeanne Shaheen in their quotes in the Bloomberg article that's been disseminated here. 2 leaders in the Senate in trying to prevent this travesty of the thrift savings plan being penetrated. Due to an awful lot of other things going on the Hill at the moment, we did not succeed in pulling them or others who are like-minded. And I just would mention that in addition to those 2 senators, we have Mitt Romney, Kirsten Gillibrand, Josh Hawley, and Rick Scott, who have written to the Thrift Savings Plan Board and also are sponsors of legislation that has now been introduced to prevent this from happening. But we do have with us, I'm happy to say, a man who has graced our programs in the past, both in person and by video. He has been an incredibly important figure in addressing national public policy issues and international ones, for that matter, for decades. Notably during his extraordinary service as the first Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives in decades, a feat that was due in very substantial measure to his success in mounting a campaign to take back the House of Representatives from longstanding Democratic control. Since we last heard from him, he has authored a major new book on this very subject. It's entitled Trump versus China: Facing America's Greatest Threat. I'm very pleased to say, among others, he has featured our friend Roger Robinson and Rob Spalding and others who have been doing heroic work in this space, and we are very privileged to have him with us by phone at the moment. Speaker Gingrich, if you are there and can hear us, we would welcome your comments specifically, if you would, about China's penetration of the capital markets and the prospect of them getting their hands on the retirement funds of, well, people like your good self and me and many others here, as well as our military men and women currently serving and those who are distinguished veterans. We are very anxious to hear about your larger perspective on the greatest threat we face, but specifically welcome you to talk about this topic as well. Welcome, sir. Well, with all that buildup, I'll reprise it shortly when he comes back. Let me just make one other comment, if I can. I thought I'm counting on my team to give me the high sign when he does call in. So, a real problem that we've alluded to here is that all other things being equal, this is going to happen with the thrift savings plan. And the strategy that the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board has adopted, at least until yesterday, was simply to slow roll this thing. Just run the clock out until suddenly it's 2020 and the decision that they'd previously made in 2017 has now happened and they can't change it. I'll come back to that now if that happens to be the Speaker of the House, former Speaker Newt Gingrich. Mr. Speaker, is that you?
Yeah, it is.
Welcome. I've just given you a wonderful send-up, which I'll just very briefly reprise by saying I am thrilled that you're able to join us by phone, and I want to say a particular word of great appreciation on behalf of the entire Committee on the Present Danger of China for your new book, Trump versus China, Facing America's Greatest Threat. We noted that you have, among others, acknowledged the important contribution being made by our friend Roger Robinson and others, some of whom are with us here today, some of whom are not, but we welcome you to talk about the broader problem that you address in this book of China, but specifically to speak about the threat posed to us of our underwriting of the threat that they are increasingly manifesting. With respect to the thrift savings plan, as well as the capital markets more generally. Welcome, sir.
Well, first of all, let me just thank everybody who's involved, and I appreciate your flexibility in letting me call in. And I can't talk equality on the other side, so
it's perfect.
I hope you can understand me.
Yes, sir.
I think the key thing I want to emphasize is that we are totally unprepared for the scale of competition that the Chinese Communist dictatorship poses, and that our bureaucracies are currently incapable of developing strategic responses, and that the system is not even capable of understanding what a society-wide competition looks like and the ways in which General Secretary Xi Jinping is leading an effort that is dramatically more sophisticated than anything we've ever had to deal with. And I would hope, as a starting point, despite the current partisan bitterness, that we would work very hard to get the House and Senate to hold a series of groundbreaking public hearings on the total Chinese competitive threat, and that we would have the courage to recognize, as the Wall Street Journal reported yesterday in a long article, that the government is in such disarray that we can't deal with 5G and Huawei. We haven't even begun to think about the development of apps like TikTok and what their meanings are as they offer Chinese-designed censorship and Chinese-designed propaganda to hundreds of millions of teenagers who pay for the right to be propagandized. And we have no language to discuss this kind of a threat, this kind of a pattern. So I believe what you're doing is very, very important. I just sent Frank a paper outlining how bad I think the situation is with 5G and the future of the internet. And having now spent 11 months on this starting with the meeting of all the American ambassadors at the State Department last January, I can report that we are further behind today, that our bureaucracies are utterly incapable of dealing with the scale of the threat, and that only a major initiative by the President himself and a major effort by the Congress on a bipartisan basis is going to have any hope of us surviving. I think we're faced with a competitor we don't understand, moving much faster and with much more forcefulness than we realize. And I think that the potential for them 10 years from now to be in a dominant position is vastly greater than anybody in our national security establishment thinks. So that's sort of my background. That's really what I wanted to share with you. I don't want to, I guess I do want to sound alarmist, because the more I've studied, the more alarmed I am. And the more I've watched the absolute failure of the American system, from a news media which is totally absorbed in partisan baloney, to a Congress which is, so far at least, incapable of looking at the big picture, to a bureaucracy which just ignores the president's instructions and continues down paths of failure, to a private industry that is stuck with massive debt and inadequate leadership and a terrified defensive position of hoping to buy a few more years at the expense of Huawei and 5G dominating the world. All of these things I found much worse than I would have guessed back in January, and I am much more concerned. And I think it should be a major issue next year.
Thank you, Mr.
I'll be glad to take questions. I must confess that the feedback makes it very hard to understand, so you may have to speak slowly or something.
Mr. Speaker, I'm the only one with the microphone at the moment. Let me just say again, thank you if you can hear me. This is, again, a vastly larger topic than we're going to address in full today, but we like to think that with your help and that of those on the Committee on the Present Danger of China, we have begun to address the elements of the problem, as you have done so well in the new book. If I could just ask you one specific question, sir. There is an effort now underway in both the House and the Senate to move legislation that would block the Thrift Savings Plan Board, shorthand for its formal title, from going forward in putting the investment funds of retirement funds of, again, those in government now and those who have served in the past, into these Chinese companies. And we've spent some time talking about how problematic a number of them are. As a man who has presided over the legislative process and has considerable influence on the Hill even yet, could I just ask you to get a sense of how urgently you would recommend your former colleagues to turn to this issue of what is going to be done with, after all, their money, perhaps to our great detriment?
Well, I think this is an area where Roger Robinson has done amazing work. And I can just tell you, I think that both the House and Senate should pass the legislation this fall before going home. And I recommend that you consider developing a pro-American versus pro-Chinese vote score, and take something like this that basically say, look, if you support eliminating the Chinese from access to our capital markets, and in particular this one step, now we're going to give you a pro-American score, and if you oppose it, we're going to give you a pro-Chinese score. And I think that kind of scorecard developed over the course of the next 8 or 10 months could begin to really frame a series of issues in a way that the average American could understand.
It's a great idea. We've done similar things at the committee, the Center for Security Policy over the years, but I think the Committee on the Present Danger could very usefully develop such a document, and we will do that. Mr. Speaker, thank you. We're at the end of our time with you, and I want to say how much I appreciate you joining us, and we look forward to getting you back here in person on an earlier occasion.
Well, I'll be back next week, and I can just tell all of you what you're doing is vital to the survival of America, and I'm honored to be allowed to be part of it.
Thank you, sir. God bless you.
Thank you.
Let me just, in closing, make one further set of remarks. The question occurs, who is deciding to do this with the funds of these patriots? I'm going to read the names of the 5 members of the board of the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board and its executive director, and just give you a snapshot from their bios on the board's own website. The chairman of the board, as I mentioned earlier, is Michael Kennedy. Michael Kennedy has a day job. All of them, with the exception of the executive director, have a day job that is not on the board. Mr. Kennedy's is as a managing director in the Atlanta office of Korn Ferry International, where he is a member of the firm's global financial services practice, specializing in commercial investment banking, capital markets, and asset management searches. Dana Bilyeu is the executive director of the National Association of State Retirement Administrators, an organization of the CEOs of the statewide pension plans in all states and territories of the United States. Ron McCrae is described as a private investor and corporate director. He's been involved with a number of institutions over the years, investing in various ways as an institutional investor for them. He was, among other things, the chief administrative officer of Nike, a company that has been prominently featured in the NBA's interests in China. William Jassian is the CEO and managing director of Stonehenge Global Partners, a firm focused on business development and capital raising strategies. Again, he's had a number of other positions over the years, but one of them was he served on the board of the Securities Investor Protection Corporation, where he chaired the multi-billion-dollar investment committee. And finally, the executive director, who is described as serving as in that position for the largest defined contribution plan in the world, that would be the Thrift Savings Plan, has worked in that organization for some time, but among other things was in the asset management industry for 29 years prior to joining the FRTIB. These are people who obviously know a lot about the investment business. This is not to suggest that that's a bad thing necessarily. It is, however, to raise the question of whether they have a conflict of interest, because they are in the sector that Roger has described that is being squeezed by the Chinese at best, and at worst is simply all in because of the opportunity to make money. And these people who have described in the ways that Roger mentioned earlier in their letter to the senators who have expressed concern about the inadvisability of these sorts of investments are, it would seem to me, ill-suited to make judgments about the prudential risk and the appropriateness of these investments, because they come from the business that has demonstrated it has no interest in any of that. That's not in the best interests of people like those of us who have invested in the thrift savings plan and who are relying on it to provide us retirement benefits that we can have confidence in. And I'll just close by wrapping up one key point that I think has been made here. This is not in the interest of the national security, clearly, but it's not even fiduciary, responsible investing either. The Committee on the Present Danger is relatively new. Our organization, the Center for Security Policy, with, I believe, Roger's help and a number of others, several years ago warned about a company called Alibaba. Alibaba is perhaps the largest corporation in the world, certainly one of the largest in China. It came to the United States capital markets and raised more money in an initial public offering than any other in history. I think $25 billion, if I'm not mistaken. And we said at the time, with no perceptible effect, anybody who is investing in Alibaba shares will own no part of Alibaba at all. They will actually own, if anything, something in the way of a holding company in the Cayman Islands, whose relationship with Alibaba is a little unclear, frankly. But it's certainly possible that in that case, as in others, we may find people defrauded of their funds. Could that happen with the corporations that China considers it a state secret to know what is their actual financial condition? You bet it could. So on all of these grounds, if I may just speak on behalf of those of us present, and I think the committee more generally, we are determined to try to make sure this decision by the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board does not stand. And we salute and look forward to working with the members of the Congress who are disposed to oppose it as well. We think the more information is available, the more certain it is they will do so on a bipartisan basis, perhaps even unanimously. And we hope also, as Brian and others have indicated, that we will see the President of the United States, as he is apprised of what's happening here, similarly decide that this is not something he wants happening on his watch, and it should not. I want to say thank you to our terrific speakers and to those who were not able to be here in person. I want to thank all of you who did join us, as well as those of you who've come in through live streaming and who will take advantage of the resource of presentdangerchina.org, where the videos from today's meeting and all of the previous threat briefings are stored. I want to say a special word of thanks to my colleagues Adam Savitt and Matt Franklin for their tremendous help in making all this technically possible. And again, thanks to those of you who are supporting the work of the Committee on the Present Danger of China. We are adjourned.